I will turn on the closed captioning as well, possibly. You might have to do something with that too, Jennifer. But anyway, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here for our presentation today. I want to make sure that I take a moment to thank our sponsors, TDS, Park Bank, and the QTI Group. Lori, you know a little bit about them. So they are such great partners and allow us to provide these events and professional development programming free to our members. So we definitely thank them for that. I know we've done at least 1,000 of these a piece, but just as a reminder, please leave yourself on mute. Consider turning your camera on if you don't have it on. It's always nice for the speaker to feel like she has an audience. The closed captioning is on. If you don't like that, you can just turn that off by clicking the CC live transcript button on your monitor. We'll be monitoring chat, so I will be monitoring chat for Jennifer. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in there. And I know Jennifer said too, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, please feel free to do that. And we'll also have Q&A at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce Jennifer. Previously, Jennifer worked in the UW Extension as the Dane County Dairy and Livestock Educator, and before that in Polk County as the agriculture agent. In Extension, Jennifer developed her expertise in farm human resource management, where she co-created a curriculum for farm owners, managers, and supervisors to learn important skills related to leadership, communication, culture, and working with others. So Jennifer, I'd love to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. I do have one extra slide that Kristen, excuse me, put in. And so I don't know if you want to do this at the end. We can always go back or. Okay. Yeah, we can.
We'll do it again.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much. And so, yeah, so actually a lot of what I'm talking to you today is from that curriculum, Becoming the Employer of Choice, kind of pulling pieces together about communication. And a lot of this is what I present to my students, which as I kind of mentioned to some of you before, when I was, we were kind of joining before we started, we're actually in session now. So my program runs November through March, and it's all for farmers, mostly out of high school, but we do have some professionals who want to change a career. And so they just started. So actually they're getting a lot of this information as well. But yeah, so communication, that one, we all communicate. Like I'm communicating to you, you communicate to each other. And so when talking about how does it get off track, I was thinking, okay, first we have to define what is communication, right? Like what is that actually is, how does that process work? Then we can look into what causes miscommunication. And then because I know that you are all business, you're involved in business, you're owners, you're working in business, what is that connection between communication and business culture? And so we'll talk about that. I do have an interactive activity for you all that we can kind of get a little deeper and bring you into kind of looking at your own business's culture. And then finally, because of course I don't want to leave you with, oh my gosh, this is all how communication derails, but also how we can improve our own communication, because we always want that, like how can we get better? So let me just make sure all my devices are working here. So I apologize. My work laptop decided it was done working for the week. And so I'm using my personal laptop to convey the PowerPoint to you, and then my iPad for video because it has a lot clearer video. And I didn't want to look at you, see me all blurry and be like, I don't even know what she looks like, right? So, okay, so I think, there we go. So what is communication? So before we figure out how to improve our communication with colleagues, our employees, supervisors, or even with family and friends, and a lot of this will apply in multiple areas of your life. And that's what I try to, because some of my students aren't going to manage employees. And so I say, look, this is going to work regardless if you're a manager, if you're an employee in a business, or if you just have family and friends. And a lot of them, of course, come from family farms. So their employers are their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. So this works regardless of who that is. But it always helps to start with defining what we're talking about, right? Good communication. We want to make sure it's clear and understood. So what is communication and how does it work? So communication is a process, much like many things. And this communication process happens between two or more people. It's an exchange of ideas, of feelings, or meaning. There is a sender. So I'm the sender right now, right? I'm sending you a message or information to a receiver, you all, who then processes it and then reciprocates through feedback to the sender. And that could be, you're like thumbs up, or you're like, I have a question because I'm confused. And it should be a pretty simple process, right? Sending information, receiving information back. So then why does it not always work? And what could possibly go wrong? Well, we'll answer that a little bit when we talk about what causes miscommunication. But first, let's dig into more of the process and how this communication process works. And specifically, by what means can we send and receive information? So here's a graphic, and it shows the different means that we communicate, which are verbal, nonverbal, visual, and written. And when we are conversing face-to-face with someone, using primarily verbal communication, like as our image shows here on the screen, the actual words we say are such a tiny part of the information that receiver is actually getting from us. So we tend to focus the most on our words, right? Like getting the message clear and what words am I using, and really focusing on the words that we're using. But actually over half of the messages that we're sending out to people are through our nonverbal body language, our eye contact, posture, like my hand gestures, right? Etc. And 38% of that is from the tone that we use, the inflection of our voice, the pitch, etc. So in fact, while verbal communication is still a significant way we communicate, whether it's remote, virtually, or in person, we are actually using a lot more nonverbal communication, whether we're intentional or not. And that will be important to remember later when we talk about miscommunication and the causes of that. So this image shows a really important piece of the communication process that we will now discuss, which are the filters, which are in the middle of that image. Okay, so filters are how the sender creates the message, processing the information to share it in a certain way, and how the receiver decodes the message, processing that information to create understanding within themselves. So we all have filters because our filters are essentially our culture. They are influenced by our different cultural identities. So just to back up a little bit about what is culture, right? Because we hear that term thrown out a lot. So culture is a system of belonging to a group. So these are cultural identities to which we belong, and they shape how we behave, think, and what our values are. So these behaviors, values, ways of thinking are taught by and reinforced by a group of people. So culture is decidedly a social construct. You can't have culture by yourself. So you have to have other people to have a culture. And so these cultural identities are more than just, a lot of times we think about gender, race, ethnicity, those are the visible ones and the ones that often come to mind or in discussion when we talk about culture. But realize businesses and organizations have their own culture too. They're a group of people, right, who have similar goals and values and ways of thinking and behaving. And so we'll talk more about that later, but that is also a cultural identity, is the business that you belong to or a part of. And cultural identities are numerous, and people are made up of a wide range of identities. So there could be potentially, multiple identities playing at play when in communication. And these cultural identities, because they shape how we think, act, and behave, are our filters for when we communicate. And so all the information that we use to construct the message as a sender is filtered by our culture. Same with the receiver. As they take in that message and information, they're processing it with the filters of their culture. So even how we construct a message, the words that we choose to use, the nonverbal actions we unconsciously are using are all influenced by our culture. And while you cannot communicate without being influenced by culture, you can be more conscious about it happening, which helps to then be a more effective communicator. Okay, so essentially thinking about what is your goal. So when we're communicating, when we're in the middle of the communication process, there's always a goal. That could be understanding, that could be action, it could be behavioral change, a discussion of ideas, idea development. These are all goals to a communication that's happening. When you are communicating with someone, you should consider what your goal is. Are you giving, for example, are you giving redirective feedback to an employee with the goal that they will change their behavior? Or maybe you're telling your significant other about your difficult day in the hopes that they will understand and show empathy, right? So what is your goal to that communication process? And then what happens if your goal is not achieved through communication? Maybe it was the means of communication. Like a good example now is sending an email versus having that face-to-face meeting, especially when giving redirected feedback. Maybe email's not going to convey the tone, the nonverbal language that you want to use, versus doing it in person when you can actually communicate more and then get the feedback directly from the employee as well. Or maybe just the message wasn't clear. Or maybe something else happened, which we'll talk about. And if the goal wasn't achieved through the communication, something happened to cause the communication process to derail. And that is when miscommunication happens. So miscommunication and the numerous causes of it are what breaks down our effective communication, causing us not to get to our goal and potentially causing conflict, discord, stagnation, misunderstanding, and more, which hurts our relationships and the business. So that's when simple communication process gets complicated. So let's talk about miscommunication and what causes it. So this comic is a really great example of miscommunication. And we can all relate to the on three scenario because, and I know I do this, but how many of you ask the clarifying question? So is it on three when we say three or right after three, right? And so this is what's happening with this comic. So when communication breaks down and the goal of the process isn't accomplished, then we have miscommunication, like we talked about. So of course, the result of miscommunication can be as simple as I just don't understand what you're talking about as a receiver, or to the more complicated situation of where the miscommunication causes conflict, right? And issues within the business. So it may have little risk to a lot of risk at that miscommunication. So going back to this comic, while it's really funny, it depicts an environment in which miscommunication can be pretty high risk, right? Now the patient's on the floor because we didn't understand if it was on three or right after three. And so hopefully the patient's okay, but that's a big issue. And we all hope that we're not that patient in surgery when miscommunication happens, because we've all heard those stories, right? So to avoid miscommunication, we need to look at what causes it. So that's what we're going to talk about now, is some of the causes. Okay. So this has, so why does miscommunication happen? And the causes are most often result of our cultural characteristics. This is the societal training that we've had, our experiences and upbringing of the people involved in the communication, whether it's you as a sender, receiver, or the other person involved. And so here are 6 causes of miscommunication that are directly related to culture. So first is assumption of similarities. Now this one's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll explain it to you a little bit. So we all assume because someone, the person we're talking to, looks, acts, or talks like us, that they are the same as us, right? In terms of how we think, our beliefs, our values, and cultural identities we have. Because you look like me, or I'm getting similar vibes from you, then we are the same, right? And because we need to operate as social beings, we want to assume similarity when working with others. It makes us happy. It makes our brain happy because brain likes similarity. So that might not be the case. And then that gets us into trouble when making assumptions. When miscommunication happens, it means that we aren't as similar as the other person. And our need for societal relationships is being attacked because our brain seeks out that which is similar, and we found difference. And assumptions about the other person's behavior, personality, culture, values, beliefs, their communication style even, can all lead to miscommunication, which then can create conflict. Okay, language differences. So this one's just as easy as I'm speaking English, you're speaking Spanish, we don't understand each other, right? Miscommunication happens. But it also can refer to, say we're both speaking English or another language, right? And then that person, the sender, is using slang or lingo that is very regional specific. So a great example of this is, since we're all from Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, pop, how many of us use pop, I know I use it, refers to soda. Well, that's great. If you're talking to someone from Wisconsin, you can say, hey, give me some pop, right? Now, let's say you're talking to someone from Boston. In Boston, pop means to get shot. So if you're asking for pop, that might really cause some issues, right? That might be the high risk situation, because hopefully they look at you like, why are you asking to be shot? Versus actually giving you pop right away. So again, very different uses of the same English word. So even if we're speaking the same language, there can be a lot of language differences that cause miscommunication. Then we get to nonverbal misinterpretation. This refers to how we understand body language, the tone of voice, and other cues that a person gives us when communicating beyond the words they use. These cues are often influenced heavily by the culture and society that we grew up in, our upbringing, or during our formative years. So for example, in the US, right, for example, think of like interviews, job interviews. In the US, maintaining eye contact when we're speaking with someone is seen as a very positive communication style, right? That embodies trust and honesty, especially when doing business dealings. Like how many times do you like make eye contact when you're making a business deal, right? However, on the reverse side, in many Asian cultures, using eye contact, especially with a younger or lower level employee with an elder or higher ranking individual, is often seen as aggressive and disrespectful in those cultures, because strong eye contact in those particular situations means you're challenging that other person, what they're saying, or disagreeing with them. So a lot of times nonverbal can be misinterpreted as well. I'm just going to go to the chat quick to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Oh yeah, soda. Yeah, sometimes I switch back and forth. I grew up, most of my formative years were over in Virginia. So a lot of times my pronunciation and stuff will change as well. But yeah, and sometimes I'll say soda. But a lot of times I think it picks up to who you're talking to as well. Like with my students, I'll say pop, and I tend to, use in a lot of their words. But great. Okay, so then we have preconceptions and stereotypes. So this one is, we have established ideas about how certain groups or individuals look, act, behave, think, feel, or communicate, because they're often exaggerations of the truth and negative portrayals of that group. So the key here is that we default to interacting with that person or with that group of people based on those preconceptions and stereotypes. Communication breaks down for a couple of reasons. One, because trust is eroded in that person that we're communicating with, who we have that stereotype of. And two, more often than not, their actions, behavior, or the way they're communicating with us doesn't hold up those stereotypes, causing us to be stressed in our brain to get stressed, because our assumptions, that which we believe to be true, are being questioned. And again, back to the brain, it likes, just quick, ready to assimilate information. And when it comes up against stuff that that information that doesn't uphold its own truths, it's like, oh my gosh, right? It's like, it causes stress. So it's important to realize with this one, though, that while the impact is just as disruptive to communication and negative for the receiver who's on the receiving end of that stereotype, more often than not, this communication is unintentional, right? Because we, as the sender, don't have pre-knowledge about the stereotypes that we carry. And so and we'll talk more about self-awareness and kind of being more open to identifying those things. And so that can be really important when we talk about improving communication. And then we have tendency to evaluate. This one is more related to that as a human being, we all evaluate ourselves, our surroundings, the people around us. It's just built into our brains to help us stay alive. Our brain's need for understanding often means it will put meaning on actions, behaviors, cues, or words, comparing this with what it already knows to be true. Another example of this is when you hold others to the same standards you hold yourself. For example, maybe you interact with someone in dirty clothes and you hold cleanliness to be a standard for yourself. Not knowing what's going on with that other person, you might communicate with them differently with that individual, because you might perceive them to be weak, right? Like, oh, you just can't clean your clothes, you're really wrinkled. Maybe you think they're lazy, or maybe there's a different class, like, oh, I'm dealing with someone who might be a homeless person. But maybe in the end, it was just that they fell in a hole on their way to work, and that's why they're dirty, right? So we tend to evaluate based on what we evaluate, how we evaluate ourselves. And then finally, which we'll talk a lot more about later, is anxiety is a state of stress. So stress is your body's response to a threat, whether it's perceived or real, and which your brain processes as a higher priority than anything else. So when you are in a stress state, that's what your brain focuses on. It's the oldest part of your brain, the defensive brain, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And that's where your instincts are housed. So that takes over. And this means that your higher brain, in the front part of your brain, where cognitive functions such as higher thinking and processing happen, just shut down. They completely shut down, because all the energy is put into, hey, this is a fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And so communication, since it's housed in the higher brain, because that speech is a higher process, In an anxiety state, when your brain and body are focused on the threat at hand, you cannot effectively communicate, and the resulting miscommunication could cause conflict. So knowing that you're in this brain state and you're anxious will be important later when we talk about how to improve communication, that self-awareness that I talked about. So just think about in terms of culturally when you are out of your comfort zone. A lot of times this could be when you travel to another country and didn't speak the language or know much about the culture. This is a very highly anxious situation because you're kind of out of, fish out of water, so to speak. So that can cause anxiety. Okay, oops. Okay, so kind of staying on the same track as cultural causes of communication, cultural causes of miscommunication. We already know that culture influences our ways of thinking. And so in this context, ways of thinking means not the logistic of how your brains work, but how you create meaning, because meaning is directly influenced by our culture. So take the image on the slide. So what do you all see? And you can unmute and just yell out what you see this image.
A bird.
Bird, yeah.
Bird. Okay, so most people see bird. Anybody see anything else?
I see a rabbit.
Ah, okay, good. So we see a duck, maybe a bird. Yeah, it can be it's kind of like a duck in a way, but yeah, a bird or a rabbit. Right, great. So why do some people see a duck immediately and then some see a rabbit? It is because our brains are wired differently, but only because of our culture. So while we may never get to pinpoint the actual cultural characteristics that make you see a rabbit versus a duck, it's not really a very good research project. It's not high profile. There's not going to be a lot of money put into it, right? Unfortunately, because I'm curious. But we know that since culture influences how we create meaning in the world around us, it is the primary influence. And now, after you've seen both of them, right? Because now that you are, say, like somebody saw a rabbit, you're like, oh yeah, I can see where the rabbit is. It makes sense. And so now that you've seen, you can see both always. And so you'll never see this image again without seeing both at the same time. And so in a way, your brain was just influenced by us, a group of people, which is culture. So there we go. We just created a cultural meaning for you on here. So a lot of people have seen this image before, but what about this one? So here's another one. What do you think you see? Or what do you see, I should say? Again, you can just yell it out. So this one's a little less well-known, and so there maybe you might not be able to see it right away. And again, cultural influences are in meaning and how we think about the world around us. So actually, this is a cow. And so let me try to, I can use my little writing thing here. Okay, so here are the ears. Hopefully you can see that. I'll outline it for you. And then the top of the head, and then the face kind of goes in like this, and that's the muzzle. And here's an eye. And an eye, and the muzzle, and then the body goes out like this. So can you see the cow now? Yeah, so yeah, this one's a little tougher, but yeah, so this is, let me clear this just so that, because I think it sticks around after okay, because I don't want it to keep, have a cow image on all of them. Okay, so, this was fun and it was interesting, but let's bring it back to communication. So say you are working with a colleague, and I've threw out a business example to kind of help us think through this. So maybe you're discussing a new product. So while you both are part of the organization's culture, so you share cultural identity, you still bring other identities to the table with you, which create different meaning for each of you. So different ways of thinking. So maybe the ad that you're working on for the new product means one thing to you and another thing to your colleague. That could cause miscommunication in thinking, and then impact how you move forward with that ad for this new product. Okay, I'm not going to show this video because I want to keep to time, but I'm hoping most of you remember the Sneetches from Dr. Seuss. It might be a while ago, but I'll explain a little bit. Otherwise, you can always watch the video on your own. It's on YouTube. But another cultural reason for miscommunication is, I guess, there we go, different values or cultural characteristics of people. But specifically here with the Sneetches, we're talking about in-groups and out-groups. And this is they are perfect, like, for explaining this, because if you remember, there's the star-bellied Sneetches and the Sneetches without stars. And so it causes miscommunication between the two groups and direct conflict, actually, because they're actually like fighting about it, because it forms them into two groups at odds with each other. They're all Sneetches, but because one has a star, one group has a star and one has without, there's difference. And difference, whether visible or subtle, are often behind situations of conflict. And so if you remember from the story, they go back and forth. There's a guy who makes a profit off of these Sneetches because he figured out how to put on stars and take off stars. So essentially the Sneetches are just going in. One group's getting a star on, the other group with the stars are like, no, we need to be different. So you're not part of us. So then they get their star removed, and it's just back and forth until they realize, well, one, this guy is making tons of money off of them. And then two, they're all Sneetches in the end. So, so in a business, this could take the form of two different departments who are working towards the same aim, but have different goals and ways of working. And then they need to come together to work on a project. And that could be a situation that caused some miscommunication. Now, generations, right? There's a lot of this going on, and especially in social media. So the generation to which someone belongs is a cultural identity. This can be another cause for miscommunication in all areas of life. Currently, there are about 5 generations in the workplace, each with their own identities. Now, generational identity is influenced by the events, the shared experiences and values of the time during your formative years. So between ages about 5 and 20 are your formative years. So while there's a lot of variability in the fact that we each have our own individual experiences, generally speaking, we can say someone who's born into this generation has generally some common characteristics by the majority of the people born into that generation. So these shared values and beliefs often get at odds with other generations' values and beliefs, causing conflict in the workplace. And multi-generational teams will see this generational differences as a common cause for miscommunication and conflict. These preferences are related to business culture, the workplace environment, and even the level of the 3 psychological needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competency that vary among the different generations. For a real life example, all you need to do is go on social media, right? Millennials and boomers seem to be the kind of the main generational conflict going on right now. So millennials, which is the generation I belong to, or I identify with, are at odds with boomers who think millennials need constant praise and only care about ping pong tables and gyms at their place of work, right? I'm exaggerating, but according to social media, if you believe it, that's actually what they say. So of course, these are just stereotypes of those generations that they have with one another. But it does reinforce that while everyone has certain needs from their workplace, there are some interesting differences in values and ways of working between the generations. So think about like Gen Zs, which is the generation below me, those 25-year-olds who are coming up into the workplace. Their preference for quick, shortened communication like texting versus silence who are still in the workplace, who generally prefer to communicate on the phone. Think of that could cause miscommunication, right? Like, why are you texting me? I just want you to call me on the phone instead of trying to send a long email kind of thing. So these are all causes for miscommunication. Oh, sorry, just go ahead. Okay, so moving away from culturally caused miscommunication, different personalities and their approach to communication can also cause miscommunication. While this is a rather silly example, it is a good one because the way the toilet paper is put on the holder often is a cause for conflict in relationships, right? Where people are living together. So an individual's basic preference and personality characteristics are a very common source of miscommunication leading to conflict. And they might start small, like annoyances or irritants, like, oh, they're pushing my buttons, or that annoys me, right? A pet peeve, a lot of people say. But over time can grow larger and become more of an issue. Difficult decisions cause tension because it's between what we want and the expectation or demands that have put upon us. All decisions have consequences, and these decisions might seem like a choice between 2 evils. So consider if the decision was made in haste and not rationalized, like a downsize of a business. When communicated to employees, that tension could be communicated to and then cause conflict and hurt relationships between employer and employees. Limited resources, right? This is how wars get started. When resources are scarce, conflict is inevitable. Competition for those limited resources is what causes miscommunication. because essentially there are competing goals in the communication process, which are at odds with each other. This can also happen in an organization like a business, when some threat, maybe like another employee or a supervisor, maybe there's one manager position and multiple employees want to vie for that one so they can move up in the position. Those all can cause miscommunication. And then getting back to high anxiety, anxiety, instead of it being caused by culture, like we talked about, being out of your comfort zone, it can also be caused by social threats. I think this has animation. There we go. The 5 social threats are safety. So how safe is it for me to be who I am? Certainty, how much predictability do I have? How much change can I handle? Control, how much autonomy do I have? Do I have control over the situation? Status, how am I valued? How am I perceived? And fairness, is this a fair situation that I'm in? Am I being wronged? Am I being treated fairly? And so again, these all cause anxiety and can derail the communication process. So here's what I talked about with the brain states. So there are actually 3 brain states, and they relate to the main parts of the brain. So we talked about the defensive brain, which is actually way in the back. It's the smallest part of your brain, but it was the first to evolve and develop. And it's the oldest part of our brain. And its primary purpose is just to protect us through instinct. So this is the fight, flight, freeze response that we've talked about. The second part is the middle brain, or limbic brain, and it is what is called the amygdala. It's the next part of the brain to develop, and this one is where all your emotions are housed. And last, but of course, one of the most important ones, because we're using that one pretty heavily right now, is the positive or the cognitive brain, the higher brain, which is at the front of your, the neocortex, and is responsible for all your higher functioning. So you're processing the language, the communication that I'm giving you, the information, you're taking notes, you're writing it down, language, communication, thinking, reason, that's all part of this brain. And so it's important to know about these 3 because they directly affect your communication. Like we talked about, if you're anxious or faced with a conflict, you might not be in the higher brain state, or you're most likely not, and you can't communicate effectively because you're just thinking instinctively. And then when you're in the higher brain, you're much more effective communicator at that time. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about communication and business culture, and thinking about how how business culture can affect communication in the workplace. So thinking about here's some examples of businesses that I generally, like, they made the top 10 Forbes list of, employers. They might be employer of choice for employees, like, they'll go there even for free. Remember that Google internship movie that was made because, people would kill each other over trying to get that one internship at Google. I know it was made a few years ago, but it's a good example, right? Like, these are employers of choice. So why is it that they have no problem finding employees and that people want to work there? And really comes down to the culture of the business. And we can find some cultural characteristics that make them stick out from the crowd. And it's not the freebies like the gyms or the ping pong tables. While those are fun, they're really only superficial elements to a business's culture. And it's the deeper values that makes a difference to employees. So a business is not a business because every business has their own culture from other businesses. And that's because the people who make up that business are different. So a business's culture is created and influenced by the people who are in that business. And business owners and managers contribute the most to that culture. That's in most research, the leader, the manager, the boss is the #1 reason why people leave. It's because of that culture that's created in the environment. So a business culture should both influence employees, but also be influenced by employees. So it's a both two-way street. And the goal is to create a culture that is reflective of the team. It's very hard to fake a great culture because if that's not how the business team works, then it's not going to work. So consider the ping pong tables, free food, and gyms idea. While those are great, if the goal is to make the culture welcoming and that business cares about its employees, but at the same time, communication makes employees feel undervalued, there's really ineffective communication happening, teams compete with each other, there's a lot of conflict in the workplace, then ping pongs are not going to help make that culture what it's not. So we've talked about culture kind of from a personal, individual perspective, but let's look at a business. So the culture of a business is really the way things get done around here. You've probably heard people say this before. It reflects how we do what we do, which is different from other businesses. It also is how people work, interact, and behave. It's the community of the business. So do we all pitch in even if no one asks for our help? Or how do people communicate in the business? Do they yell and talk over each other? Do they communicate in writing? These are all how things get done in the business. And finally, the business's culture represents the true core values of that business. These are the shared beliefs and values that are intrinsic, like in any cultural identity. So respect is a really good example of a value. Safety is another one, especially in a business. I know one of business owners I work with, they run a farm. She told me that one of the core values of their business is that everyone gets home safely at the end of the day, and they communicate that to employees, and employees know and respect that. Okay, so I'm trying to think if we have a little time. What I'll do is I'll share this with you in the chat, and then maybe as we're talking, and then maybe at the end, if we have some time for discussion. Oh, let me see if I can. I can't get the link here. Okay, I guess I got to minimize this and move some stuff around here. Too many windows open. So this is kind of a way for you to kind of evaluate, if you will, your own business and the business culture that you come from. So there we go. Okay, so here's the link. So I'll put it in the chat. Okay, so hopefully it should be anybody with the link can go in there. So hopefully that doesn't cause any problems. And so essentially it's a form for you. And while it's shared by all, so you won't be able to make edits to it because everyone will be able to see it. But it's an opportunity to kind of see some on the spectrum, different cultural values and kind of rate your business. So from your own perspective in your role in that business is how does that culture play out, right? And then I use this with my students all the time. I have them go through because a lot of times we take things for granted, like how we communicate or how we like to work together or not, right? Maybe we like to work individually on our own. What are our values? And so we work through this to identify like, oh yeah, okay, we tend to be more direct communicators. Like if something's wrong, we talk about it. We don't run around the bush kind of thing, you know? And so, so we work through that. So I'm gonna let you kind of read that on your own, take advantage of that. And then we'll, hopefully if we have some time, we can discuss it. So we can get to some of getting to improving your communication. Okay, so let me move this back up. Okay. So why do we care about business culture, right? So how does it fit into a business? You know, because businesses, we want to be productive, we want to be solvable. So how does culture fit in, right? Because it doesn't really translate into money easily. So for a business to be successful, it needs to be both healthy and smart. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those. Okay. So healthy, what does that mean, right? Like how can you take a temperature of a business? So what that means is how the people are doing who make up the business, right? How are the people? So a business is successful when it has high productivity. These means that the people are productive and there's minimal downtime, low turnover among the 20% of your top employees, high morale, right? Both employees and then also managers and owners, high job satisfaction. Employees hopefully enjoy what they're doing. They come to work, you know, happy. Minimal confusion. They have training. They know what's expected of them. And minimal politics, that they work together as a team. There aren't any factions or like, you know, oh, we're at war with that department. Everybody has the same goals and outcomes. And then, so where does the business culture fit in? It fits into this healthy side of the business. Because it affects literally all the criteria we just talked about. But at the same time, a business needs to be smart. And this is what you tend to go through when you're doing an MBA, right? Or you're getting trained in how to manage a business is kind of the smart business sense area. So decision-making, production, is it reaching its productivity goals? Strategy, is there a plan, a vision? Marketing, how is the brand of the business? What kind of communication is happening with consumers, and of course, finances, right? Like, are we making a profit? How is the financials handled? So really culture is a key piece of business, and communication fits into that because it's key to employee engagement. belonging is one of our main three psychological needs of human beings. And so we have a desire to belong to a group of people, right? We're social. And so we are herd animals, if you will. So if employees feel like they are part of something, it means they belong and their need for relatedness is met. So since organizational culture is a cultural identity, and that's how we use to connect with others like us, but communication is one way to get to that cultural identity, feeling like they connect and they're important piece of the puzzle. Now, these things don't just happen overnight. It's really, you have to kind of work at creating that, right? Like I said, it comes from all levels of the organization to create that culture. And effective communication builds trust, allows for feedback, shares vision, mission, goals. And that can be really positive for employees to meeting that, like, hey, this is a culture of an employer of choice, right? Somebody that I want to work for. And like I talked about, it's not directly related to like, oh, you're going to lose X number of productivity or finances, but it actually does relate to the smart business sense too. Like there are some impacts of miscommunication that are on the bottom line of the business. For example, and they're pretty significant. For example, miscommunication causes high turnover, more employee mistrust of the business, more stress, more conflicts. Also, your leadership might erode because if miscommunication is not dealt with, and then again, that goes back to the trust. It also reduces performance, productivity of employees. Of course, effective communication, if there's a lot of miscommunication, you're not communicating effectively, so that goes down. Also, openness and teamwork. It's hard to work with people if you don't trust them and feel like you can communicate effectively with them. So it does have a significant impact on the bottom line of a business, even though you might not be able to see it as a line item directly. Okay, so we're going to finish up with how to improve communication. And so we know what already causes miscommunication and how important communication is in a business culture that engaged and meets employees' psychological needs. So how do we improve our communication to be more effective and improve our business processes? So again, like I said, self-awareness is so key. We really need to start with ourselves. You can't control other people, but you can control yourself. And regardless of whether you're the sender or the receiver, it's really important to cultivate that self-awareness in order to communicate effectively. We saw how emotions get us off track and make us more poor communicators. And so when self-awareness is really just like looking inwardly and asking yourself, what am I feeling emotionally, physically? What track are my thoughts taking? Am I in that brain state, right? Which brain state am I in? And that's to identify the brain state you're in so that you know, I'm really feeling a lot of anxious. I came from a really horrible meeting, it was a tough one. I had to fire an employee. I'm really feeling really bad. Now I have to go talk to another employee. Maybe I need to take a little time, right? Because I'm not going to be able to communicate effectively with this employee because I'm bringing all these emotions with me. And you can do that by kind of cluing into your cues, and so these are some examples of generally what happens to people when they're in the different brain states. And these cues are essential because they tell you how you're feeling or what brain state you're using, right? Or you're in. They don't necessarily apply to everyone. So it's really important to know what your own specific cues are. For example, I suffer from general anxiety. For most of my professional life, I've had anxiety, which makes it really difficult. But I've come to know that my defensive brain state pretty well. Like I know exactly when I'm in that defensive brain and I'm not going to be an effective communicator. So for me, one of my cues is that I actually stop breathing. Not that I really stop breathing, obviously, but I'm taking such shallow breaths that it feels like I stop breathing. And I also get really warm inside. So I'm almost overheating. And that's not on here, but that might be something that you also share. And remember that we need to be in that positive brain state because that's how we can communicate effectively. And you can't control other people's brain states, but you can control yours. And you might be more self-aware in that you can also help them identify their brain state and be like, hey, it seems like, you're maybe under a lot of stress right now. Let's table this meeting and give ourselves a little time to kind of calm down a little bit and come back to it, right? That's a really great way instead of trying to push through that communication and not reach our goals. And then knowing your triggers also can help you get out of that defensive brain state. And triggers are those buttons on the issues, actions, or words that set you off, like, right, pushing people's buttons. Because when you're communicating, you have two choices. You can be instinctive or thoughtful. And instinctive is that you're just reacting You're doing instinctive behavior, right? Fight, flight, or freeze response. Where thoughtful is you're actually using that higher brain to think about it, to kind of consider, how am I going to respond to this, the feedback I'm going to give back to that person. Defensive brain states encourage a reaction, whereas you want to be in a positive brain to be thoughtful before responding, because reacting just exacerbates that miscommunication, causing more conflict. Of course, active listening, right? We all can take lessons on this. There's a lot of information out there on how to be a good active listener, but it is really a key element in effective communication. Both the sender and the receiver should employ active listening to really get at that understanding, because remember, it's not just the words you're saying, but all those underlying messages that you're getting from that sender that you need to also be listening to, cueing into. And then it goes both ways, right? The receiver needs to listen to the message the sender is sending, but then the sender needs to listen to the feedback the receiver is giving them. So here are some 10 steps for active listening. Empathy, I'm not going to read all of these. These are posted everywhere, but it's not just about being passive and agreeing with everything that's said. It's really about listening to learn and understand and hear what is being said, both hear the message, but also the cues, the body language. And being an assertive communicator. That's one of the key pieces of being an assertive communicator. Being an assertive communicator helps you express yourself, share your point of view, and explain your side without minimizing your position or feeling like you're giving in. And active listening helps you to that. And the difference in this style of communication versus those other three that you can see on the chart is that you're still respecting the other person. You're not demeaning their point of view or what they're saying, but you're not giving in your side either. So it's a way to kind of get both sides met. It's very open and very highly considerate of others, and helps you to earn others' respect because you're listening to them and you're encouraging that trust. And so really, now that you've known all the causes for communication, you're able to kind of keep an eye out for those, right? So you can avoid those pitfalls in future conversations. And while you can't really avoid them all the time, but you are more aware of them, and you can be on the lookout for these causes to go a long way in helping you improve your communication. Much like with self-awareness, recognizing them will make you more readily to spot them in your own communication, or maybe also in others and how they're talking. And then you can kind of stop the communication process, because you do have control over that, right? You can say, hey, let's take a break. We'll talk about this later, or meet individually one-on-one with someone if there's a particular issue. And whether it's identifying common stereotypes or different ways of thinking, these are all now hopefully you're more in tune to keeping an eye out for them. And so hopefully miscommunication won't have as much power now that you're able to recognize the signs. And added to that, to your own self-awareness, you're going to be a much more effective communicator. So with that, I know we wanted to finish up at 11. And so I'm open for questions. If you have any feedback, or you wanted to share a little bit of when you were looking at that form, I'm just going to let it open for everyone.
I have a couple comments / questions to your active listening piece of the presentation. I'm somebody who I typically don't mind getting up and presenting in front of people. And I have found that I have no desire to try to present over Zoom. And I think it's because I don't get that active response. One, you don't get that vibe and the feel and the energy of the room, but then also, I am interested in feedback, and I want to make sure that I'm connecting with the people I'm talking with. And there's no way to do that because you can't just look out and see it. And it has really caused professional anxiety for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. I think generally people have realized, we all thought it would be easier. Like, oh, it's so easy. We can be in our homes, we can present, sit here. I'm actually standing because I do better when I'm presenting when I'm standing. And but yeah, we've realized that and without maybe consciously recognizing it, that all those nonverbal cues that we normally take in that really help us be like, okay, yes, I'm connecting, or no, I'm having confusion, so maybe I should explain better. All of that is kind of gone by the wayside because either, you don't have your video on, or you just don't get the same because there's an extra filter in there between what it gets to me from you as the receiver giving feedback to me, there's that computer screen in between. So yeah, I think a lot of people have realized like, wow, okay, it's not as easy as I thought, because I have just no sense of how I'm doing. I'm just kind of avoid. Yeah.
Yes, it's awful. It's awful. We had Rosa, was attended. We had our first strategic planning session face to face last week, and the year before we did it through Zoom, and it was so much more interactive. And anyway, so it was so nice to have it in person. And one of our strategic initiatives was to define our culture statement. So a lot of what you said makes me feel like we're on the right track to have that as one of our strategic initiatives. And then not only to develop that culture statement, but to make sure that we have an entire plan to communicate that out, because we have such a wide range of members. We have different industries, business size, cultures, backgrounds. And so how do we make sure that we aren't just creating a statement, which is extremely important, but communicating that out in a way that resonates with a wide range of backgrounds and
yeah, because that employee engagement, I mean, it's great if you have a culture statement, but if it's not getting down to the lower levels or everyone in the business, then you can't get that buy-in and engagement and people being like, yes, I belong to this. And so like the farmer who says about culture, they do everything from like branding. And I know this is pretty common in other businesses, but not so much on farms. Employees love wearing the branded clothes that they have. And because when they go out into the real world, into shopping at grocery store, everybody's like, oh, you work for Rosie Lane. And they're like, yeah, I love it there. They kind of, they take it into their personal life too. So, that engagement is so key to getting employees to buy in, and then also to reflect that culture back, because they might, if they don't buy in, they're not going to uphold those values as well. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Any other questions for Jennifer? This was awesome. Great presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm going to share my slides, and of course this will be recorded. So I know it's a lot of information. I always have that problem, right? I'm like, oh, there's so much I want to convey and share. So hopefully you'll have time to kind of think about it, and then go back and look at the slides and everything too as well.
Great. Yep. I'll be sure to get that sent out to everyone. If you wouldn't mind, Jennifer, going back to, I think it was the second slide, just real quick before we go. I think I have it here too.
If I can do this.
Speaking of being behind a computer screen, who is ready for some in-person networking? I know I am. All right. So we're going to finally have an opportunity. We're going to do Business Social Hour on December 9th. So check that out on our website. More information there. And then we have Get Moving Middleton on Thursday. 7:45 networking, 8 o'clock programming. So Thursday, December 2nd, our Get Moving Middleton will be still virtual, but we plan on, fingers crossed, starting January 1st, those will be in person as well. So make sure you get that on your calendar. And there are 2022 sponsorships if anybody's available. I expect to see every single one of these faces in person. So make sure you check out our calendar, get all that information.
I just want to say too, feel free to use that Google form, save a copy for yourself. I think you can do that. If not, message me. Yeah, because that's a great way. Like maybe you aren't at the level of kind of, oh, what is our cultural statement, or how does our culture work in our business? And that's a great tool to just get you started and having those discussions, whether it's within your manager team, your owner, whoever's the owner, the leadership team, or also with employees. And it's kind of a good way to kind of start those discussions if you're not there yet too. So yeah, please use it. That's what it's for. I wrote
down quite a few phrases. I did save that document, and we spent a lot of time as a group, just like brainstorming, we have pages of like, what does culture mean to you? How do we, and we put it into the categories of growth, community, and purpose. Like, what does growth mean to you? How does our organization tie to your personal culture of growth? And went through that. So it was a really good exercise. And I'm glad that we had this so close, because it was just last week where I really was able to tie it in. So it was very beneficial, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you. Yeah, I know it's hard when I ask my students, I'm like, okay, so what's the culture like on your farm? They're all, blank stares, like, I don't know, because it's kind of like that blank slate problem, right? Like, you just don't know until you start getting questions or you like throw out words and you're like, oh yeah, okay, this is how we communicate, so yeah, no, I'm so glad it was helpful. So yeah, and feel free anytime, any questions.
Okay, great. Send me this PowerPoint. I'll get that sent out to the group. Any other comments or questions before we end the meeting? Going once? Going twice? All right, I'm ending the meeting, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.